Hi, my name is Isami, and I am a survivor of CSA and human trafficking. I was born and raised in Japan. I grew up there until I was 17. My dad was from Japan. My home was an unsafe place for children. It was extremely abusive, physically, emotionally, spiritually. The only thing that was missing was sexual abuse. There was definitely a lot of mental illness in our home, and unfortunately, with the way I was raised, it was never addressed. So my mom had what I would assume to be some sort of mental health disorder. It caused her to have a hoarding and shopping addiction, so it led us to not have a lot of food in the home. We were on scarcity pretty much most of the time. She was emotionally and physically abusive. Now, she wasn't as physically abusive as my dad. If there was anything that I needed, I would go to her first. My dad, on the other hand, was very distant. I was also homeschooled and rarely allowed to leave my house. So there was a lot of just staying silent. We were not allowed to show our personality. If we did, there was definitely physical consequences. Sometimes we got in trouble for things that we didn't quite know why we were getting in trouble for. But of course, with the cult background, there was always some religious reason as to why we were being punished, and a lot of times physically. I think with my parents, the cult kind of progressed. So I remember being very, very, very young. I'm talking maybe 5 or 6 years old. And while the home was still physically abusive, and they were physically abusive to one another, and that's what I saw as a young child. Those are my first memories, is them being abusive. They still had somewhat of a community outreach where they cared for people. And that kind of started to go away as they became more paranoid, really, within their religious beliefs and became more shut in, closed us off from the rest of the world. What was really strange, though, was there was a lot of focus on outward appearance. So, down to our clothing, I was not allowed to wear pants growing up as a female. If there was any hint of immodesty, that could also result in physical punishment as well. So, outward appearance wise, we were the perfect Christian cookie cutter family. And that's why instruments were largely involved too, as well as to impress other people. But when it came down to actual religious practices in the home, I would say they were barely there, practically non-existent. I remember my parents did not allow me to watch. There was like a kids show called VeggieTales, because they didn't use the same version of the Bible that they thought was the inspired only version of the Bible for the Word of God. But I was allowed to see rape scenes at 5 years old. A lot of things that were contradictory. So it was hard for me to get a gauge on what it meant to have a religious compass, to have spirituality. Honestly, all of it was for show. It was very hypocritical. This was the type of environment that I grew up in. Now, looking back, I realized they had to do this in order to feel good about themselves, because there was so much internal chaos and no inner peace within our family. When I was really young, my dad was trying to start a church. Unfortunately, he had a very severe unchecked anger problem. I remember as a young kid, we would rent community centers and serve the community there, but then he'd get in a fight with another missionary, and then they'd part ways. And when I was about 8 years old, we moved to a city right next to a U.S. Air Force base. And honestly, it was a hard time, because that's also where I met my sexual abuser. But at the same time, because we were renting that building from the English speaking church, in order to save face and keep a good relationship with them, I was allowed to hang out with some of the kids every now and then. So that was a plus for me. It's a very small light, but a light in a very dark place that got me through a lot of those tough years. But during that time, I was allowed to attend some of their worship services. And while they were renting the building from them, there were some people attending. We weren't there that long, probably about 4.5 years, if that. I know my dad got in a fight with multiple people there, but I was allowed to go to worship services there. Now, the church was more leaning towards that cult side as well. They were also that very, very sexist, very homophobic leaning type church. And so I didn't really experience what I know now to be worship, where it's more free and more personal. It was very fear-based. So pretty much all of it was. And then when we would come to the States to visit our sponsoring churches, because that's where their money was coming from, we would also visit Hellfire and Brimstone churches as well. It's so funny, because they all taught something slightly different. And by the time you tour the US for a whole year and you hear slightly different at all 350 churches. You're kind of confused as to what you believe anymore. But that was my worship experience as a young child through my teen years. I just thought everyone was abusive to their kids. I thought every family had physical altercations. I thought that every child was treated this way in the home. And what started to make those wheels turn a little bit for me is I had a friend that lived on the military base, and I was allowed to visit her every now and then. And one day I went to her house, and my lip was actually swollen. My dad had stuck his fist into my face earlier that day because I wasn't smiling. And so I went and saw her, and she noticed that my lip looked a little weird. And she asked me, are you okay? That doesn't look normal. And I said, oh, I got in trouble today. I just remember her looking at me, and she didn't understand what I meant by that because that's not what her family did. And I said, well, doesn't your dad ever hit you when you get in trouble? And she said, no, he doesn't do that. He loves me. He would never hit me. And I was young. I didn't quite understand why there was such a vast difference there, but it made me start to wonder, oh, maybe not every family is like us. And honestly, it took me until my 20s when my sister had her son. It took me seeing her raise my nephew with her husband, and realize that there is a sense of love when you're in a healthy family. There is a sense of wanting to give correction but not to harm a child. Watching her love him in a way that I never saw growing up has really been very healing to me as an adult. So the people that we were renting the building from them, and we had various people attending, and this couple started attending our church. They came from South Korea, which is a highly advanced country, and they seemed to be doing well for themselves over there, but they left their infant son. Something happened where they couldn't go back, and she lost custody of their child. And there was no explanation there. But quickly, they got everybody's favor. So she started playing piano for a church, and she started taking a liking to myself and some other young girls in our church. But I believe they were going through something that they were hiding from their spouse and the church. And on top of that, they had something else going on where they must have had an attraction to young girls. And they took a liking to me, and they quickly started asking me questions about my family. So, do you get in arguments with your dad? Wanting to know the family dynamic, if I was in a safe home. And they were going after people who didn't have a support system. They sexually abused me in front of my mother, and my mother just laughed. They groped me, and then started touching me underneath my clothes, and my mom thought it was hilarious. And so they knew what they could do. And so when it came time for me to get a new piano teacher, because I had taken piano lessons before this person, and it was such a almost a mandatory thing in our family. You had to learn an instrument. How else would you convince pastors you were a great family when you came to visit the States? So I had already been taking piano lessons before this person, but the girl that I had been learning from was part of the military church, and she had moved. And so I needed a new piano teacher. Of course, my mom loved the word free. And so when she realized that even though I was being sexually abused, this person would teach me for free, and my siblings, I was fully handed over to this person. My mother even allowed this person into our home behind closed doors. So they had access to me privately many, many times. They would even have access to me at church. So the church was a split level, and sometimes we'd be upstairs and I would be taking piano lessons downstairs. Basically, I was being molested while everybody was upstairs, and this person had free access to me with no supervision. I don't think their spouse knew. I remember one specific incident, and I do have complex PTSD, so a lot of my memories are blocked out here and there. I remember an instance being left at this person's apartment. I remember how it felt. I remember just feeling like I was going to throw up, but in between the time I got there and the time that I left, and we drove past a liquor store and the light was flashing, between there, something happened. I don't know if she gave me something and I passed out, or something happened to me. I do remember being physically sick, bleeding. There were things that happened to me when I was left at this person's home, but her spouse was not there. There was also an instance, though, where I was left downstairs that I vividly remember, and she had stuck her hand down my shirt and was fondling me. There was one entry and a second entry into the auditorium of the church, the front door and then the worship auditorium doors. They heard the front door open, and then they kind of took their hand out and stopped. And then they opened the main auditorium doors, swung open. It was their spouse. So they went back to pretending like they were playing the piano, and I just stood there frozen because I didn't know what to do. So this person was very, very intelligent. They knew what they were doing. They knew that my mother was fully on board with this. They knew that I was scared. They even found out that, because I told them, things about a boy that I liked. There was a kid that went to the English-speaking church, and I had a huge crush on this boy, and I wasn't allowed to have feelings for anybody. One time my mom saw that I had a photo of this kid, and I got in trouble for having that picture of him, and I wasn't allowed to like anybody. So expressing any of those feelings I would get in trouble for. So I was very afraid of that. But this person knew that I liked this boy. And so they would use the littlest things to make me scared, even down to, they would make up situations where I was in trouble. Maybe I didn't practice enough, and they would tell me, well, I'm not going to tell your parents this time. But they knew how to use situations to keep me in fear and keep me from saying anything. And my mother did the same. There was an instance where I kept telling her, if a child that young comes to you and describes something in explicit detail, especially a kid who's not even allowed to have sex education, there might be some red flags there. And so my mother was worried I would tell my dad. Looking back, I see that's what it was. My dad probably would have done something, even though he was physically abusive. So to get me to shut up, she sat in a piano lesson with me, and of course nothing happened. And so afterwards she said, don't ever speak of this again. If you bring this up, you will be in trouble. And so that kept me quiet, and I never told anyone until I was much older as an adult. But there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of control, but it was all deliberate and all calculated. So with this person, started around age 9. It lasted until I was almost 14. In between then, there was a time where this person had to start working different shifts, and so they couldn't come to our church anymore. So I was sent to a different piano teacher that was actually good, and I actually liked piano lessons at that time. But 9/11 happened, and so I couldn't go on bass anymore. And so then this person, of course, magically showed back up in our lives again. And so I went right back to them for a lesson. And then they ended up leaving our church, and it wasn't for reasons I would have hoped they would have left for, but essentially they got in a fight with my dad because they wanted to become a deacon. So they didn't want to just be the music person anymore. They wanted to be a church leader, and my dad got in a verbal altercation with them in a screaming match over the phone. And so he told them, don't ever come back again. I ran into them again at a grocery store when I was 15. And I just remember being completely frozen and just feeling sick when I saw them again. But I have no idea where they are. I don't even know if I have their real name. They had overstayed their visa in Japan, and so they were there illegally. So I don't know if I knew their real name or not. I've tried to look for them, but I don't think at this point I'm going to. I've made peace with that, though. I have. And so, I'm okay knowing that I'll never get justice for myself. And I think that's why I'm so vocal when it comes to these types of things now, because there was a long period where I felt both guilt and fear, and also anger for not having that justice. And I don't ever want anyone else to feel that way. And so that's been a driving force in my life to be very vocal about these types of things. Well, my dad actually, from what I'm aware of, still does not know till this day. He has no clue. I never felt safe enough to tell him. But as an adult, in 2012 to 2014, I was a flight attendant with Delta. And that was the first time I ever had anti-human trafficking training. And this was more of a global scale, not really more domestically, which I've learned can look very different after I've had some of that other training. But there was an instance on my flight where there was a family and there were a lot of red flags. It was a very long flight. It was from Minneapolis to Japan, so over 12 hours, I believe this flight was. And there was a child, a mother, and a man. I'll never forget his face. I'll never forget the way he behaved. I recognized even myself in this kid. Like, I know those behaviors. Something's going on. I notified our flight leader, and she told me, well, let's notify the captain. Let's let him know what's going on. And I did. And I said, is there any way that we can have something investigated here? Maybe we have somebody meet us at our flight or something. And his response was, well, just keep asking questions, but don't bother them. They're probably on vacation. I carried that guilt for a very long time when they got off that flight. And, my job is just to sit there, and I'm a translator on this flight too, because I speak Japanese, and my job is to attend to our Japanese speaking passengers. They have questions about their connecting flights, where they're going, and this family in particular was connecting to Thailand, which is often a major trafficking hub. But I'll never forget his face when he got off that flight. And I left the flight at the end. I couldn't get off the flight until everybody had deplaned, and I got on the crew bus. And I went to my hotel, and I just can't get this family out of my head. And I'd written down their connecting flight information. And I remembered I had my laptop with me, and there was a line called Blue Lightning. It's for aviation industry people. And so I called them, and I said, hey, I'm a flight attendant with Delta Airlines. I just got off this flight, gave her the number, gave her the seat, gave her the description, clothing, the connecting flight. This is approximately the time they're going to be landing. They're going to Bangkok, Thailand. There's a young child with them. I'm concerned. And the operator took down all the information I could give them. And she said, okay, well, I have to pass this on to government authorities there in Thailand. But I have to tell you that the government operates differently over there. So I can pass this along. But I'm afraid I don't know if there's anything else I can do. And I will never forget that feeling of just hopelessness. And if you've ever been in a car accident, you've heard that initial crash, or you've heard a gunshot, that ringing. You hear nothing else but that ringing sound. That's basically all that was playing in my head for about a week. I came home and I looked up everything I could to know how I could fight this. Because I knew I was going to see this stuff again. I found an organization called 821 and started doing research, and got involved locally in anti-trafficking, and then later on I moved to Atlanta and learned more about domestic trafficking and how that can look a little different, and got involved with helping kids that were forced into sex work and trying to get them out of there. And I did that for a while, and then I was actually in 2018, 2019, I started working with a safe house in Pensacola, Florida, and I was their social media director at the time, and I was actually training people on how to spot the signs of human trafficking. And we were talking about how to connect with survivors, because a lot of these volunteers would be answering those messages, the DMs that would be coming through. And so I shared a little bit of my story, and I remember a volunteer pointing out to me that what had happened to me was called familial trafficking. And I didn't want to accept it, because no one wants a title on their name. And it was the first time that I realized that my story was also related to this, that it was connected. I wasn't shipped overseas on a plane, but I was trafficked out by my own family. I had made so many excuses for my mom. Oh, she didn't know any better. Maybe she was confused. All the things that I look back now was the way that my 9-year-old self tried to survive and reason everything out. because my mother was also my comforter when my dad physically abused me. So how could she do this? That took me a while to fully accept it, and I think it was after COVID that I'd finally verbalized that what had happened to me was human trafficking. I stopped allowing myself to feel guilty for not knowing any better, and I worked through that. I've had really good therapists that have helped me along the way, and I'm so grateful for them. But that acceptance brought me so much hope. I know that's crazy, but it did. I would have never, ever spoken publicly about it had I not found that hope for myself, found that healing, and that finally having a name to what happened to me, and just putting that to rest, almost in a way putting that 9-year-old version of me at ease, letting her know that it wasn't her fault for not knowing how to ask for help, or not knowing what to call. So that has really been, both of those situations have been pivotal points in my life where, this is personal. This was really personal for me. And a lot of times I see people in the comments, and some of them even 60 years old, people say, now I finally know what happened to me as a kid, and I relate to that so much. And so this is why I share, this is why I speak, because there's so many people just walking around in the dark, having no idea what happened to them. They'll blame themselves. And then there are people who are actively living in this situation that have no idea that it's not their fault. And so, to me, if it takes my weird ass self and my story to help someone, and if I can help even one person realize they're not alone, then I've done my job. And I couldn't save that kid, but I really hope that me and all the other survivors out there who are now aware, who have eyes and ears on the ground, can prevent kids like that from ever experiencing the hell they have to go through. And that's what brings me hope.